Thanks very much, Richard, for the very kind introduction. Thanks very much to Inya and to Barbara for the invitation to be here today. Thanks to all of you whom I can see now. Thank you. Thanks to everyone online. And thanks to Fatima for really a lovely segue into my talk. She mentioned at the very end, there's so many ways to hear. And the recordings I'm going to be talking with you about today were made at what was known at the time as France's National Deaf-Mute Institution. This was the terminology of the time, of course. Today, it's known as the National Deaf Children's Institution, but it had everything to do with hearing. So let me set the scene for my talk by telling you a little bit about this collection of sound recordings as a whole. The collection consists of 228 unpublished wax cylinder recordings, which have recently been catalogued and digitized by the French National Library. They appear to have been in something of a derelict state when they turned up at the French National Library in the mid-20th century, and thus very little is known about who made most of the recordings, when they were made, or why they were made. All we know is that they seem to have been made sometime between about 1912 and 1929. These are the dates of the speech laboratory as it was active in the early part of the 20th century at the Deaf-Mute Institution. And it was the period during which its first director was actively making recordings. That's the only way that we know when most of these recordings were made. And this is, I've corroborated this with the curator at the BNF, and there's just very little that we can know. According to the very, very limited amount of information provided on the cylinders themselves and their boxes, we can identify a few people involved in making these recordings, but most of them remain unidentified and unidentifiable. According to the finding aid, and there's even very little information about who made this finding aid and when, maybe sometime about 20, 25 years ago, but not quite sure. The recordings were made in the institution's speech laboratory that I already mentioned, under the supervision of its first director. His name was Hector Maréchal. Around the turn of the 19th century, he was one of France's leading researchers in the field of deaf-mute education. And again, I know this is the terminology and the ideology of the time. I realize how problematic and paternalistic this sounds today. Like many educators of the deaf active around this time, late 19th century, early 20th century, Maréchal aimed to help the deaf speak, not to sign. He wanted to help them speak. And he wanted to help them speak the French language, or rather a standardized version of the language that's long been associated with the nation's seat of power, Paris, as opposed to the dialects that were still spoken throughout France around this time. Teaching the deaf to speak rather than to sign had been common practice among educators of the deaf since at least the 1880s, when the French state ordered school teachers to stop using sign language and to use speech instead as they were educating these people. It wasn't just France, this was a wide European mandate at the time. So it should come as no surprise that most of the recordings made in the speech laboratory were diction exercises of one kind or another, apparently recorded by the institution's patient pupils and their professors. So we hear vowels, simple phrases, that sort of thing repeated over and over again in front of the phonograph. But what I was surprised to find were about a dozen or so, 17 recordings made by opera singers. I'm happy to tell you more about these and in the question and answer period, but for now I just want to introduce you to one of these operatic recordings. So this was made in 1916 by a member of the Paris Opéra's company the contralto Ketty Laperrette, or Catherine Laperrette. And in her recording, she intones a series of vowel sounds, runs through a few scales, speaks briefly, and then sings an excerpt from Mon cœur s'ouvre ta voix from Saint-Saëns Samson Dalila. You can see everything that's in the recording transcribed up here, and I'll play it for you in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you what I'd like you to listen out for. It's the first part of the recording that really intrigues me, and the scales in particular. Something strange happens the first time she shifts from A on C4 to O on D4. It almost sounds like a crack in the cylinder, or a glitch maybe in the digital transfer. But she seems to react as if something is amiss, and I hope we'll be able to hear it today. I can hear it in my headphones. She takes the time to place and then replace the next vowel, the E, before tentatively traveling up and down the octave. Her next scale sounds slightly more secure, but when she returns to the A-O combination, she falters again at exactly the same point as before, stumbling as she moves from the A on C4 to the O on D4. So I'll play this excerpt in its entirety for you now, and I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on it afterwards.
Honneur et gloire aux défenseurs de Verdun. Mon cœur s'ouvre ta voix, comme s'ouvrent les fleurs au baiser de l'aurore. Mais toi, mon bien-aimé, pour mieux sécher mes pleurs, que ta voix parle encore. Dis-moi que Dalila, tu reviens pour jamais. Redis à ma tendresse les serments d'autrefois.
So there's lots we could say, and we will say about the recording, and again, I'd love to hear what you hear in it. But for the moment, I hope you could hear the glitch that I was talking about. What is this glitch, and what could the speech laboratory have offered her by way of a cure? I'm not a speech therapist, though I have consulted a speech therapist about this recording, and I'm not even a very highly trained singer myself. So I've taken a cultural history approach to this sound recording. I started by trying to find out everything I could about Hector Marchal, the institution's speech laboratory director. I reasoned that if I could establish his priorities at the speech lab, maybe I could establish why she'd brought herself there and what exactly she was being treated for. So Maréchal thought that if deaf people could compare their speech against other examples, ideally in visual form, they would be able to learn to speak properly. In collaboration with several other significant inventors active around this time, he developed audiovisual technologies to visualize speech. So in his lab, we know that there were, for example, experimental technologies for filming pupils or patients in the act of speaking via stop-motion photography, the predecessor of cinema. And this is one example of that kind of technology at work, or rather the results of that technology. There were also experimental technologies for capturing visible traces of the voice via a graphing machine that transferred the long wavy lines etched into wax cylinders onto paper. This is what that machine looked like, the lyrograph, and here's an image of it in use. So you see a student vocalizing, and you see the machine on either side recording and transferring it to paper in real time. So at this point, it's important to know, I think, that in France, and here's one more image for you, sorry, just an etching of some vowels that Maréchal made and published later in the 1920s. At this point, I think it's important to know that in France, deaf people and provincial patois speakers had long been seen as similarly disenfranchised due to their lack of command over the nation's official language, similarly in need of linguistic improvement before they could be considered fully fledged French citizens. This is how they were treated by the state and by the educational systems. Maréchal and his colleagues worked primarily with deaf students, trying to enfranchise them by way of speech, but they also treated members of the wider public, perhaps most notably people who came back from the war, having experienced hearing loss or shell shock, but also other members of the public. So, having discovered this much about Maréchal's method, I've turned my attention to La Parette. What I discover about her is that she had, in fact, been born and raised in the French provinces, in fact, in the deep south, in the Lower Pyrenees region of France, where she would have learned to speak one of several regional subdialects, all of which have decided differences from Parisian French. One of the most important of these distinctions has to do with the pronunciation of the phoneme O at the ends of many words, pronounced O in the center of the province, A in the east, and in the north and the northwest. So could it be that La Parette's stumble on exactly this phoneme has something to do with where she'd first learned to place it in her mouth? Could she even distinguish a difference between these sounds, having grown up hearing them used more or less interchangeably? Whatever the case, it seems is possible it was something to do with her accent that led her to visit the speech laboratory. Maybe she was trying to cure her accent, in other words. Or this is what I wrote in the first draft of my book manuscript. In the meantime, I've been making some revisions, and I found myself wondering if this story is maybe a little bit too top-down, a little too dependent on tiered models of scientific knowledge production, a little too sure that the singer in question would have been a passive recipient of whatever therapies were on offer. These questions only occurred to me after I returned to the archive earlier this year and finally listened to the rest of the recordings, not just the operatic ones, but the rest of the recordings in this collection. So one of the things that stood out as I was listening is the really wide range of activities reflected in these recordings. Certainly, some of the cylinders do seem to capture the oralist method in action, something of what's shown in this image, deaf pupils filing in front of the phonograph, painstakingly repeating vowels and phrases after their professors. But others are less easy to categorize, especially those made by adult members of the deaf community. I found one, for example, made by Henri Gaillard, a former pupil of the National Deaf-Mute Institution who'd become the editor-in-chief of several newspapers written by and for deaf people. He'd also become an outspoken critic of deaf educational practices of his day. His recording sounds just like those made by the students. He repeats a series of French words after Maréchal. But the newspaper article he wrote afterwards makes it clear that this was just a test rather than a form of therapy. He was trying to work out what the speech laboratory was good for, and he does in fact seem to see Maréchal's work as potentially productive rather than oppressive. Spending time listening to these recordings has reminded me to keep some space open for other possible interpretations of all of the recordings made in the speech laboratory, including La Parette's. It's also sparked what I think will be my next major research project, which will take representative cylinders from across the collection as case studies, and aim to demonstrate that the ways in which vocal difference and disability were imagined in Third Republic France were actually much more diverse than scholars, including myself, have sometimes suggested. But to bring this back to La Parette, her recording and opera, could it be that she was not the passive patient that she initially seemed, but instead an active investigator of her own voice? Might she have been using technologies and therapies intended for one purpose for alternative purposes of her own, thus twisting these tools around on themselves? If she was indeed trying to eradicate her southern accent, or erase its effects on her singing voice anyway, might she have been doing so wittingly, well aware of what she was doing and why, but without necessarily believing the nationalist rhetoric around being and sounding French? All of these questions lead me to two simple points, and I realize I'm preaching to the choir here. So, as scholars, we need to resist monolithic narratives about what vocal training and technology did and what it does, especially when they seem to align with sweeping state-mandated initiatives. And we also need to take care when working with early sound recordings, slippery artifacts that may or may not be what they seem to be, and all the more now that we mostly encounter them in digital form, often without any of the context that might help us make sense of them. Thanks very much.